I guess we'll go ahead and begin. I want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us again. Really appreciate you all taking the time to meet with us. Julia here from Juris Education. We are going to be discussing LSAT strategies and insider tips today. So really happy that we were all able to join us because we've got a really fun and really informative webinar for you. So just to touch on what we're going to be talking about, we'll be touching on effective study techniques, mastering logical reasoning, reading comprehension strategies, insider tips from top scorers. And then, of course, our two panelists really weigh in and talk about their experiences, and they'll be able to help you out with that. I'm having a little technical difficulties here. My bad. Okay. So a little bit about us. If you are unfamiliar with Juris Education, we're an admissions consulting company dedicated to helping deserving students get into the law school of their dreams. We believe in starting for law school prep as early as possible. So we work with people as young as, in their first year of high school, all the way up to when you'll be starting to fill out your application in your final year of undergraduate or afterwards. Our program is really supported to kind of guide you through the whole process of your application, from your letters of recommendation, writing your supplementary essays, working to figure out the best kind of volunteer opportunities or clubs that you can join. Really anything to really strengthen your application. We've been doing this for over 15 years now, and we've had an acceptance rate of 94%, as you can see. And people that work with us are 4.5 times more likely to get a scholarship. So really awesome. If you haven't heard about us, check us out. And going on to our next slide here, I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to really introduce themselves and talk a little bit more about their background. So Madeline, if you want to go first, and then Mika, maybe you go afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Madeline, and I'm an LSAT tutor. I did my undergrad at Georgetown University, and I took the LSAT 4 years ago in 2020 and scored 173. I've not yet attended law school. I have 2 little kids, so they keep my hands pretty full right now. But law school is on the near horizon for me, which I'm excited about.
So I guess I'm kind of the opposite. I took the LSAT in 2011, scoring 172 and then a 179. I attended the University of Chicago Law School, graduated in 2015. I clerked for a corporate bankruptcy judge in Delaware, and then worked as a corporate bankruptcy litigator in Delaware and New York for about 5.5 years before leaving the practice of law during the pandemic and returning to teaching, which I had been doing before law school. I do LSAT tutoring and admissions consulting.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So before we begin, just want to do 1 or 2 housekeeping things. Just want to flag that we will be recording this webinar. So if you want to go back and watch, we will be sending it out to all attendees tomorrow morning. So stay tuned for that. We will also have a designated Q&A section at the end of the webinar. So if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, we ask that you hang on to them and type them in the chat box. And then one of our panelists will be happy to answer those for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our webinar. Mika, do you want to take the first slide and then we'll go from there?
Absolutely. All right, so let's start out with just the basics of setting up a good study plan. I can't tell you how much consistency and just making time for the LSAT matter in this process. As you build your skills, you need to remember that the LSAT honestly involves an immense amount of material and takes a long time to master. So planning ahead is important here. Developing a study plan that sort of divides things into bite-sized chunks, into individual tasks or skills or question types to focus on is really important. And as you improve and practice, right, you need to continue shifting your focus from fundamentals to more and more actual prep test practice, right? Creating test-like conditions so that you can correctly gauge your score level. It's a very, very long process, but I recommend you think ahead. You invest in some sort of study plan that you're going to follow, and that you commit specified times each week, right? Block it out on your calendar. Every single Sunday from 1 to 4 is your LSAT study time, no matter what. The people that do that tend to succeed.
All right. And so to get a little bit more into more specific study strategies and techniques that you can apply and bring to, the studying that, as Mika said, you show up to and prioritize consistently. One is, pattern recognition. This goes back to when Mika mentioned how, there's a lot of material to familiarize yourself with. The more practice you do, you become exposed to all of the variety of the different question types that they'll ask, different types of passages, topics. I always say, the more you see, the less surprised you can be. That's why practice is so important. If you recognize that there's certain areas that you perhaps are a little bit weaker on, it can be helpful to do some more focus and targeted drilling. So, if, a notorious question type, perhaps like the necessary assumptions, if they give you some issue, it can be helpful to, again, practice those more specifically while not neglecting the entire component of the exam and still continuing to do, full sections, full tests. And then certain test takers like to do what's called a blind review method, which can be an effective strategy of reviewing your missed questions. This involves essentially going back and reviewing questions before you check your answers. So that way you have the opportunity to correct mistakes and sort of proactively dig into why you maybe missed a question, what went wrong, without having the crutch of knowing what the right answer is to lean on. I think this technique can often help push people to really deepen their mastery of the exam.
Okay, so there are now 2 types of sections that are scored on the LSAT. There used to be a third, but it was eliminated. There are 2 sections of logical reasoning and 1 section of reading comp. That's the portion of the LSAT that's scored. So obviously, because logical reasoning occupies 2 sections, it's wildly important. Logical reasoning covers a lot of different things, but if I were to sort of boil it down to a core, it's understanding and attacking arguments, right? So you go from questions like main conclusion, which just test your ability to be able to comprehend the language and the way the LSAT is written. Strength and weaken questions, where you're directly attacking or trying to prop up an argument. You have things like most strongly supported, where you're supposed to infer information based on what's been provided to you. There's a lot. And I didn't even mention conditional logic yet, which is really its own whole thing off separate from the rest of the LR section. So it's a big topic that you need to spend a long time on, but it's also, again, break it down into both skills and question types and focus on those things individually as you progress, right? Again, consistency is on the slide for a big reason, because consistency is wildly important. A lot of logical reasoning questions have overlapping skill sets, right? And so being able to understand how to translate those skill sets, being able to put in the time to see the patterns, right? Just like Madeline mentioned on the last slide, that takes consistency. Yeah.
And now, again, to get a little bit more specific, I don't want to be too redundant here. I would say the identifying key elements, I think we've touched on a bit. A really essential component to the LR section is, of course, identifying attacking arguments. So we need to be able to correctly assess and identify what the argument is expressing. This is truly non-negotiable in this section. Being really mindful of certain language, watching for certain logical flaws, ways that arguments tend to be problematic or easy to attack. Again, I just mentioned being very careful with the specific language they use. They like to be kind of sneaky and tricky, manipulative with the way they express things. And then, of course, how we actually approach the questions themselves. Some people find it helpful to read the STEM first to know what they're asking, although I think some people prefer to read the argument first. I think it's somewhat personal preference. One thing I do think that can be really helpful is essentially treating the questions almost as if they are fill-in-the-blank questions or short answer questions, being able to anticipate and predict what you're looking for in those answers before you even then look at the answers. If you have a solid idea of what you're looking for, it can allow you to more efficiently go through those answer choices and pretty easily, I think, eliminate the more obviously incorrect ones before then selecting that correct answer.
Okay, just want to use this as an opportunity to check in because I know we have a lot of information coming at us all at once. So let's use this opportunity to maybe take a deep breath, stretch, and let me tell you about this special offer that we have. As a little thank you for joining this webinar, we are offering all attendees 10% off of your entire program with Juris Education. And you also get a free consultation. So what's the harm in really booking with us? What's the harm in really booking with us and, you know, seeing how we can help you out with that? And remember, just as a forethought, you can scan the QR code and you can also type in 10 off web when you log or when you're checking out of our services. And of course, we'll be sending this out to you guys afterwards. So if you want to go back and maybe take a picture or a screenshot of it, you can do so. All right, back to our regular scheduled programming.
So we've got our other big section, reading comprehension. For everybody who's unfamiliar with the LSAT, reading comprehension passages are usually like a page and a half to 2.5 pages in length. The LSAT often steals them from actual academic articles and other stuff and then makes them worse written on purpose. You have about 27 questions to do 4 passages in 35 minutes. So reading comp is extremely time pressure. I wouldn't say that improving reading speed is really the right way to put it. It's more about understanding what's important in the passage, what you need to remember, versus what is a detail that you can quickly look up if it's needed for a question. Reading comprehension is generally like split. You could say there's a bunch of big picture type of questions. And inference type questions. So things like what's the main idea of the passage or what was the author's opinion on X, right? But then you also have very detail oriented questions. It's about like I'd say like a 70-30 split. So the key is to prioritize what's important when reading. Either use highlighters or note taking effectively to retain that information and then moving quickly through the questions. The most important takeaways obviously are the big picture stuff, right? So what's the author's position? What are they trying to prove, show, convince us of, or explain to us? Understanding essay structure is actually really useful for reading comp. Being able to describe how an essay is progressing, right? This is the introduction. This is where the author first signals their intention. This is where the author describes the debate and then provides evidence in support of one side. Right? Knowing how to describe what a passage is doing is really important here. So there's a lot of study here, but I would say the biggest thing with reading comp is always the time element, right? It's a lot of ground to cover very, very quickly. So efficiency is the thing that you should be thinking about as you study and prepare for this section.
All right. And diving a little bit deeper here, again, some of this Mika already touched on, but just to elaborate a bit, some specific strategies to help with the section. Really important to read actively. There's a lot of ways that, you know, that can enforce this or reinforce this, you know, annotating or highlighting if those are useful to you. I'm someone who prefers to kind of keep things as a thought summary. Again, it depends a little bit on personal preference, but the active element is, again, non-negotiable. I always say no zombie reading, all right? We can't just check out and read. We've all done it before, right? Where you read some sort of paragraph and then you're like, what? I have no idea what they said. Really doing whatever we need to do to stay engaged and stay active. And a lot of it, I think, just also comes through practice and repetition. We build our stamina. It's like building muscle in a gym, right? If we do a little bit every single day, it does get stronger. Again, paying attention to the author's tone and purpose. They really do emphasize these big picture questions in terms of what is the author trying to express in the passage. So we really want to be mindful of that, or various perspectives that we may have in our passage. Focus on eliminating wrong answers instead of searching for the perfect one. I think oftentimes a really common experience of people studying for the LSAT is this dreaded situation where you're looking at your answer choices and we're down between two and there's two that may seem really similar. And I think oftentimes a helpful way to reframe it is, instead of thinking of like, well, which one's the best or which one's better, look for the wrong answer. Look for maybe what isn't working or is problematic, because, you know, if we're sort of feeling stuck, that like, it all sounds good, and we get a little bit overwhelmed or confused, kind of shifting the way we think about it can often allow us to see it from a different perspective and have that sort of that breakthrough moment. It also says tackle passage-based questions in batches rather than one by one. I'm not sure what this means. I don't know, Mika, if maybe you know, if it's like doing big picture questions first before the detailed ones. I'm not sure if that's what that is referring to.
I think that's what that's meant to refer to, is taking care of all the big picture ones and then go through the detail questions. Yeah.
Okay. Which again can be an effective strategy. I would say I personally probably just tend to go one by one or in order. I do think, again, what really is non-negotiable is making sure we comprehend that passage really, really well. The questions, no matter what order you do them or how you do them, are going to be infinitely more difficult if we don't have a good grasp on what the passage as a whole is trying to express.
So, I mean, again, the word consistent is everywhere in this for a really good reason. I don't know. I often tell students to aim to study for like 200 hours before their first exam. I think people kind of hit their, not max score, but they're really approaching it at that point. The people who actually put in those hours are the ones who set aside time each week to work. Most of you are probably students. Some of you might be working adults. Life gets in the way really easily unless you prioritize. So consistency is the goal. I generally tell students to take one practice test per week. Although early on when I'm working with them, when they're just starting out, I don't have them take practice tests, because what would the point of that be? But once you've really covered the basics of the LSAT, you understand the question types broadly, you start to develop your skills, then you should be taking regular practice tests, both to track your improvement and to get you used to what it'll be like on test day. And that's one of the other things I point out to students, is that on test day, you are switching between question type constantly. You are switching between passage type. You are switching between sections entirely, LR to RC, back to LR potentially. There's a lot of mental shifts that you have to make very quickly and seamlessly if you want to do well on test day. And the only way you can learn to do that is by practicing that, right? Second big thing on this slide, right? Analytics, right? Know what your weaknesses are. I strongly promote question journals, where students record wrong answers on questions that they didn't fully understand, and then they try to record what they did wrong, what they should have understood, and what they're going to take forward from it into other questions, right? So taking the time, not just rotely doing questions, not just rotely taking practice tests, but reflecting afterwards, right? Taking the time to review and think about what you don't understand and need to study next. That's how you improve quickly. Yeah, so I would say analytics is wildly important. Really, really important to think about what you're doing wrong and not just about what you're doing right. Yeah.
All right, and just again, sort of elaborating on those ideas. We sound like broken records with the consistency, but again, it really is so important. I think it's really the single most effective thing that you can do, just being very consistent with that schedule, sticking with it. If you show up and you put in the hours, you will see the progress. That, I think, is kind of the beauty of the LSAT. I mean, I think it definitely has this reputation for being difficult and being this beast that has to be tackled to go to law school. But you do get out what you put in, and obviously, if you don't put anything in, you won't get anything out, and it's hard to make that progress. But again, if you're showing up and putting in the work, it can go a long way. And wanting to review those mistakes really thoroughly. I think a lot of times, even when people are studying and maybe they feel like they're not making the improvement they should, often it's because they're just sort of what I call throwing darts at the dartboard, just kind of doing questions and seeing what sticks without really analyzing, what mistakes are being made, what patterns are occurring, what should be adjusted, etc. Taking time tests to simulate real test conditions. This is also really important. I think a mistake I sometimes witness is people will feel pretty good with the questions themselves and feel like they have a really good grasp of the concepts and the questions, and then just go and take the test, and it's like, everything falls apart because they just don't have practice doing it in that test environment, with the timing, with just the environment of it being, section after section, etc. You want to make sure that the studying that you do is of high quality. Yes, volume and quantity is important, but so is quality. So really trying to minimize distractions if possible. Again, I know it can be tough. People are busy, and this can be sometimes difficult to prioritize, but really trying to be creative if you need to, do what you need to do to make sure that not only you can get the quantity in of the studying, but the quality as well. It can be helpful to expose yourself to a variety of different resources. There's a lot of, books, videos, practice, tutors, etc. Oftentimes hearing or learning from different perspectives can really enrich your own understanding of the exam. Now, while we, of course, have talked a lot about how important it is to be consistent, I think that also entails being a bit flexible and creative. I think sometimes if we're overly rigid, if we're like, okay, I must study 3 hours today, and then as soon as there's a minor inconvenience, it goes out the window, right? But I think what can often help, allow one to stay consistent and dedicated is to be a little bit flexible or be a little bit creative, to make sure you can get that studying in and make your studying sustainable, which is ultimately what's most important.
Test day. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you all have taken intense exams before. This will be another really, really intense exam. I tell students that it's good to have exercise and mindfulness habits built in by the time that day approaches. Stress management is a big deal on the LSAT. Burnout is a very real thing that happens to people if they're not managing their emotional and just sort of general sense of well-being. So really think about that as you go along. I'll give you my number one tip, honestly, which is never work 7 days in a row. There's just no reason to. You're just going to hurt your motivation and your long-term ability to focus and study the material. But things like deep breathing are a great thing to do on test day. I did it on test day. If I felt that I was starting to tilt or that I was becoming uncertain of myself or just any sort of really emotional disturbance, I stopped, I breathed for 5 seconds, I got back at it, and I got a 179, so you should listen to me about how to do this. But seriously, forcing yourself to keep going when you're tilting is never going to work out well, right? So finding a way to relax, finding a way to manage that anxiety and stress, both leading up to the exam and on test day, is genuinely critical. I cannot tell you how many students, actually it's not a ton of them, but I have definitely had students that they scored significantly below what they were, practice testing at. And on all of them, it was just like, yeah, I lost it on test day. I got to the 3rd section, I was exhausted and I couldn't focus. And suddenly, right, they're in time trouble, and that it just snowballs. Other test day strategies, if you're taking in person, show up to the test center like an hour ahead of time, especially if it's like a place that you're able to sort of walk around and be in ahead of time. Being comfortable in the atmosphere that you're taking the test is really important. So get there early. I also think like little calming rituals are really great. Some people just like listen to music for 20 minutes, whatever it is your thing is, it's a good idea to do. I often tell people to like do 5 LR questions about an hour for the exam or 30 minutes before. You don't score them or review them. It's just to sort of warm your brain up. And I really like this last bullet point. Focus on one question at a time, right? If something happened early in the exam, if it was the previous section you weren't happy with, learn to drop it, right? Focus on just what's in front of you, right? You can deal with the anxiety and stress at the end, but staying focused on the question you're looking at is probably like the #1 most important thing. Yeah, so emotional management is important. Yeah.
All right, we'll talk a little bit about time management specifically on test day. It says here use a watch. Now on the LSAT, it is digital now. It's not pencil and paper. So there is a built-in clock or built-in timer, I should say, on your test. So you will be able to see it. Although, of course, if you prefer to have a watch as well, that's fine. But again, if you don't wear a watch, it's not a big deal. There'll be a timer built in, and you'll be able to sort of track your pace and just be mindful of it. We don't want to be neurotically checking it so that it takes us away from being present in the questions. But again, it is there. I think being strategic about the way you tackle the questions. It says here skip difficult questions. Typically, at least in logical reasoning, they are loosely arranged in terms of increasing difficulty. So the questions tend to get harder as you go through the section. There can be difficult ones early on. There can be easier ones later on, of course, but this general increasing slope of difficulty as the section moves along. So if you ever find yourself feeling really, really stuck, and again, in a position where maybe you start to feel yourself really overwhelmed or a bit panicky, that's where, as Mika mentioned, to use those tools of taking deep breaths, kind of really centering yourself. And maybe if it means just stepping away from that question and moving on to something else, then that is what is best to do in that moment. If you're really prepared for your test day, ideally there won't be a ton of situations where this will come into play, and you can sort of use this tool mindfully and strategically. And then allocating time for a quick review at the end. The exam, there's regular time and there's LSAT time, and LSAT time is like triple speed, it feels like, and the time goes by really quickly. And again, as we've talked about, managing the time in the section can be quite challenging, particularly in reading comprehension. But, if and when possible, I always like to say, aiming for a little sweet spot of like a minute or two at the end, just to see, dot our I's, cross our T's, metaphorically speaking, of course, just seeing if there's any, questions we have time to quickly go back to, or maybe there is something that we just really felt stuck between two and just want to take one final look. Really just sort of wrapping up the section mindfully.
Okay, common mistakes to avoid. Yeah, there's a lot of common mistakes, but I'll say this, right? #1, review. Like that one is just obvious. You will not get better if you just do questions, quickly look at what the right answer is, and don't stop to think about how you could do better on this question in the future. So again, I'll go back to question journals as being a really good use for this, like something that really helps you do this in a constructive, effective way. But in general, I would say you should spend at least as much time reviewing as you do taking questions, as you do answering questions. Yeah, I have students that want to cram, right? They want to meet with me the day before the exam. I usually tell them, I'll meet with you if it's more than 24 hours before the exam, but you genuinely really should take a day off before the exam to breathe, rest, and be ready for the real thing. Forcing yourself to study and work up to the deadline, taking an entire 3.5-hour practice test the day before you take a 3.5-hour test for real, it's not a great idea. And I'll just say, again, this applies to your studies in general. right? Mastering the LSAT takes a long time. Getting to 170 takes a long time. Getting to 160 takes a long. Getting anywhere on this test takes work. So if you decide that you're going to take the test 2 months from today, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that's not enough time unless it's literally your full-time job is now studying for the LSAT, right? Don't try to cram this exam. Plan ahead. Next one with like focusing on one section over the other, it's a genuine thing, right? I often do, like if I'm working with students, I'll do a lot of LR, then have a small block of reading comp to get them started on it, then push them to, kind of we go back and forth as needed depending on practice results. Don't obsess, right? Don't try to be perfect. Try to maximize your score. That's all that matters at the end of the day, is you getting the highest score possible to help you get into the law school that you want to go to, right? And finally, time management. I often tell students, right, when you first start your learning, it is not about being fast. It's about understanding and mastering the skill set. Once you get to that point where you're really, really entrenched in the skill set, you feel competent and you're doing well on questions, then you focus on time. So I do stage that process a fair bit for my students, but I will say that at the end of the day, this is an extremely time-pressured exam, right? In logical reasoning, you usually have 35 minutes to answer 25 questions. In reading comp, you have the same amount to answer 27 questions. You have to start thinking about that at some point. And if you haven't started focusing on time management stuff by within like 2 months before the test, you need to shift your focus to it heavily at that point, because it's really challenging, genuinely really challenging.
Right. So again, just some additional things that overall can improve accuracy and speed, which again, as Mika mentioned, and I'll definitely emphasize or reiterate, that the accuracy needs to be in place first, or the mastery needs to be in place first. I always say, there's no participation points on the LSAT. We don't get extra credit for just finishing all the questions. We have to make sure we're getting them right as well. So again, really, really making sure you are mastering these questions, being able to really deeply understand it. If you happen to get one wrong, really, really thoroughly engaging with that, making sure you understand the question perfectly, before moving on. And then once that mastery is in place, again, then it is working on that timing. A lot of it, I think, too, with the timing is, we have to put ourselves through it and get used to it. I think I notice a lot of times people can have this hesitancy to engage with the time practice, and they'll feel really great with the questions, and then just be like, okay, test time. But the only way out is through when it comes to increasing our speed. And again, it's like if I decided I wanted to run a marathon in 6 months, I can't just pick up and magically do it. I'd have to train and push my speed a little bit every day, or I imagine that's how that works. I've never done it. But that also is, maybe I'm not the most appropriate one to speak on the analogy, because clearly I just said I've never run a marathon. But again, we have to push ourselves with that speed, do those time drills, do those time sections, those time tests, build that stamina. The test is long. So also, even if we get used to the pace of an individual section, we also have to get comfortable with the pace and the stamina of not just doing one section, but 4 sections in a row. So again, it requires a lot of practice.
Okay, so final tips, kind of hitting a lot of the stuff we've just been talking about, right? Learn the skills, learn the question types, learn the passage types, then focus on speed, right? But if you come in with this trying to force yourself to be fast when you're just starting out and learning, it's really going to hinder your development, right? Skill building, then speed building. Taking long breaks during study, taking breaks during long study sessions. Yeah, look, I was a practicing attorney for a long time, which meant I worked 50, 60, 70-hour weeks. And you still need to take breaks. No one can survive this sort of intensity of mental effort without giving themselves a little break. So if you've been studying for like more than 3.5 hours straight, i.e. the length of an actual test, take a break, get some, sugar or some glucose of some kind going, like eat something. I don't know, but give yourself a breather. Don't kill yourself over this test. Be measured in your approach. You don't need to obsess. You don't need to work every second. You just need to be consistent and plan ahead. Practice test results and analytics. We kind of talked about that earlier. Being thoughtful about what you're doing incorrectly and focusing on those topics is wildly important to actually improving. If you aren't checking what you're doing best and what you're doing worst, you're likely going to waste a lot of study effort on stuff that you just don't need to be focusing on right now. When you take practice tests, genuinely try to make them as realistic as possible. There are two options now. You can take it in a test center or you can take from home, right? So think about which one you're going to do ahead of time and make sure you're practicing in an environment that mimics which one you're going to be at. So if you're going to take it in a test center with 100 people on their keyboard or on their computers and clicking mouses and whatever next to you, go practice in a coffee shop or a pretty well traversed library, right? If you're going to be working at home in complete silence for 3.5 hours, make sure that that's what you're doing during practice tests. And yeah, review explanations. There are lots of free ones out there. I strongly recommend everybody invest in some sort of test prep website because that also helps track your analytics. And all of them will provide very thorough explanations. That said, I think it is often valuable to not just rely on explanations from other sources and force yourself to explain it to yourself, to reason out why you were wrong. Obviously, when you're first starting out, that's not the best approach. But as you progress, you should try and test yourself more and more to figure out what you did wrong without immediately looking at an explanation. At least that's kind of my thought process. You need to use them, but not rely on them overly much and never develop your own sense of what's wrong. So I think these are a good set of final tips. And tutoring is a good investment. I always point out to people that general math is each point on the LSAT is worth about $10,000 in scholarship money, right? Most scholarship money for law schools is merit aid, right? So it's mainly based on your stats and your application package. So tutoring is a really good investment. Here or elsewhere, it's still a really good investment. Yeah.
Okay, we're just about to go to our Q&A section. I know there's some questions buzzing in the chat. Love to see that. We'll get to those in just a second. But before we go ahead and jump into that section, I just want to say that we are interested in learning about your feedback about this webinar. So if there's something that you think we should be talking about, or if there's something you would like to see next time, please let us know by scanning that QR code. Your feedback really helps us improve and helps us to continue doing these webinars and offer even better webinars than what we've already done. So your feedback is greatly appreciated. And now let's go ahead and move to the Q&A section. I know we have a couple questions already, so I'll go ahead and start with Sophie's, who has two questions. Question one, any tips for the last 2 weeks before taking the November test?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take this one. I think the reality is it's soon, right? So if you're in terms of where you're practice testing, if you're pretty far from where you want to be, it's not likely that it's going to be busted out on test day. This is just me being honest, right? But I think that's where what you can really control over the next 2 weeks, in addition to your practice tests and just continuing to be consistent with your studying, is really working on, I think, some of those stress management techniques, your mindset, just trying to be in as calm, cool, collected as possible heading into that exam. I know it's easier said than done, and of course it's normal to have test day nerves. It would be strange if you didn't, right? But there's a difference between maybe being nervous for the exam and sort of a debilitating anxiety. So, especially the week of the test and especially the day before, really trying to take it easy.
And I'll be happy to handle the other one. Because I do admissions counseling as well as LSAT tutoring. My typical rule is you send an addendum if your score dropped after a test, right? If you took it and got a 158 and then you took it again and got a 151, that is worth sending an addendum to explain the drop. But if your LSAT score is less than you hoped, that is not a good reason to send an addendum, as it would just draw attention to that number more. So addendums are really used to explain away bad things, right? And having a disappointing score is not a bad thing in the same sense that dropping 7 points from one test to another is a bad thing. So I would recommend it only in those circumstances.
Okay, amazing. Just to flag, I noticed some people asking some questions in the Q&A portion of Google video, wherever this is. Could you please just type those into the chat box just so we have everything contained in one space? On to our next question from Nashia. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Are there certain resources you'd recommend? Example, PowerScore, 7Sage, etc. Thank you.
Sure. I'll answer this, and Mika, feel free to add your own perspective as well. I tend to be a fight for simplicity type of person. And when I personally studied for the exam, I was pretty analog. I was me and those paper tests. And, I sometimes Googled some explanations, really pushing myself to provide my own explanations. And if I needed, I would look up explanations. I know off the top of my head, like PowerScore, for instance, they have pretty accessible, like, free explanations on their forums. So that's a really great free option. There's a lot of subscription platforms that, again, as Mika mentioned, have cool analytics tracking, which I think is a pretty good feature. I know 7Sage is one that does that, LSAT Demon or some. I personally just analog tracked it. I still got all the data. It was just written pencil and paper by hand. I think for me personally, it really benefited me from taking an active role. I'm someone who, if I'm not like a, participant in the process, like, I just maybe struggle to stay engaged. Whereas I think some people are sort of more the opposite. They really benefit from seeing that information, like, clearly expressed to them, and then, implementing that feedback. So all this to say, I think a lot of this is personal preference. I think it could be worth, trying out different things, see what works for you. I think, I've heard pretty good feedback about a lot of those resources. But also, sometimes it can be worth trying it out on your own and seeing what works, seeing what doesn't, kind of getting your feet wet and then adjusting from there. I think kind of being open-minded and flexible with how you're approaching it is helpful. And I think the most important thing is being really mindful if something's not working for you, because, you don't want to, if something's not working, it's not going to magically, get better, and kind of being able to pivot and maybe experiment with a new resource or a new way of approaching things. Maybe, you've been using a self-guided plan and you think you would need more support or an accountability working with a tutor, right? Again, I think even though this exam is standardized, it's the same test for everyone, I think the approach in the study process isn't necessarily going to look the same, and not every resource is going to work the same way for each person.
So I was a lot like Madeline when I studied. It was very analog. That was also 2011, and the world was a little bit more analog back then. But I currently use LSAT Lab with all of my students. It's my favorite test prep site to use. I think it has the nicest interface and the deepest analytics. So that's who I use. 7Sage is, I think, typically, or was considered, the standard for a long time. I would not attest to them still being the standard. Blueprint, PowerScore have both been around for a long time. They're great options. PowerScore has its books. That's what its big thing that it's known for is. Never used LSAT Demon. Have not heard mixed things. Yeah, at the end of the day, you should explore it a bit. There's definitely a lot of options out there, but I wouldn't say that investing in good test prep aids is a valuable thing. I mean, ultimately, you talk about one of these sites, it's like $60, $65 a month. Like you're going to pay like, what, $114 to make one application to one law school, because that's what they charge now just for you to submit applications. It's really worth investing in one of these resources, in my opinion. So, you know, Google the reviews, go to Reddit. There's lots of opinions on Reddit, and see what you think. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, we have 2 questions from Diana, so we'll start with the first one. What is one thing you would do differently as people who have already taken the LSAT?
Ooh, that's a good question. I feel like I have to think about that for a moment.
If we're talking about in general as people, I probably would have gone to a lower ranked school with more of a scholarship, because debt is bad, and traps you in places you don't want to be. In terms of LSAT studies, I wish I had maybe started a little bit sooner. Maybe I wouldn't have taken it twice if I had started sooner. I was one of those people who only studied for 2.5 months, but it was my full-time job, and I was at the library for 6.5 hours a day for those 2.5 months, 6 days a week. So I wish I had spaced it out more. I think that would be my biggest regret as like a studying process. I just forced way too much on myself at once. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd probably echo something similar. I remember I kind of studied over the summer, and I signed up for an August test, and I felt pretty ready. I felt good about it. But that year, there was no September test. It was August or October. And I remember like late July, I was like, do I want to do August or do I want to do October? And I ultimately went with August, and it went well. But, you know, I think also it would have maybe gone even better if I had just given it an extra 6 weeks. I don't regret taking it in August, and it all was fine. But if I had to go back or change something, I think it could have been worth putting in that extra, 6 weeks. It really wouldn't have been that much more time.
Okay.
I see Diana's other part there.
Yeah.
So thank you for the compliments. That's really nice and sweet. What do I think made the biggest impact? I was teaching the ACT and SAT when I took it for the first time, and I got a 172, which was high enough to let me become a tutor. And so I immediately became an LSAT tutor. I think this was for Kaplan. It was in person. 2011 was a different time. But I think working with other people really enhanced my understanding of the LSAT. Being able to explain things to other people really improves your own, your thought process and the conciseness with which you express yourself, which again is one of the reasons why working with a tutor is great and why forming study groups is really valuable. Even if you're all quote unquote bad, explaining your thought processes to each other will help all of you improve. So if you have friends or know people at your school that are taking the LSAT, I would strongly recommend that you band together and work together sometimes. Not all the time, but like once a week, twice a week, something like that.
Okay, question from Virginia. I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, but what is the recommended study time prior to the big day?
Yeah, I know Mika mentioned she typically recommends or suggests 200 hours. It's kind of tough to quantify. Sometimes people try to measure it in months or weeks or hours. I typically like to measure it in hours because, how you distribute those hours, could be different for everyone. Interestingly, when I started studying for the exam, I had just read somewhere that to score highly, you need to study between 150 and 300 hours, which was an unhelpfully large range. So in the process, I was sort of curious. I was like, I wonder how long it will take me. And I wasn't setting out to hit any sort of hours of time, but rather I was just studying until I felt ready. And it was 215 hours. That's how long it was. So I feel like it kind of it echoes that time frame anecdotally.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. 200 is a good benchmark to really feel like your score is hitting near max at that point. I tell people that around 400 hours you'll probably come basically max out, but the amount of improvement from 2 to 400 is slight. So unless you're really gunning for that 170 plus score, 200 is okay. If you're gunning for a 170 plus, I would say even more. Yeah.
Okay, question from Shani or Shanae. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. What does the private tutoring component consist of?
I mean, I can give like a broad overview. I think the normal packages are 24 hours, 48 hours, or 60 hours. Um, I've been doing this a long time and I do it full time. So I have a syllabus that I work with students through, just kind of like a clear study process, session by session of what we're going to try and cover, what skill set we're going to be trying and building, all of that sort of stuff. Obviously, it's online, so a lot of times it's me sharing my screen, whatever test prep website. Well, for me, it would be LSAT Lab. I'm sharing that screen. We're working together on things. I incorporate videos from them. I have a couple of written resources that I created myself. I have a couple of exterior written resources, one free and one not, that I also use with students. So I think part of the value you get with a tutor is that they kind of know what they're doing, and they can help you make this into a very manageable and understandable process, right? And help you stay accountable on progression, on how much time you're spending, all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, I think that's like a good broad description of kind of my interactions with students for the most part.
Amazing. Okay, a question from Haneen. I'm 17 and taking the January LSAT. Would you recommend sending an addendum if I get lower than a 160, or should I just wait until I'm 18?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So 17 years old, are you graduating from college? Because you have to graduate from college to go to law school. But I don't know if you get lower than a 160, if this is your first ever exam, I see no reason to send any addendum, because that is just the score you got, and talking about how you wished you had gotten a better score isn't very helpful. I'm not sure about waiting till you're 18 or why that matters. So sorry.
Okay, moving on. Question from Samara. I'm studying now, but I'm debating on if I should take my LSAT in February or in the summer. I'm also an undergrad. Do you have any tips? My professor said that if I take multiple LSATs, my score is averaged out. Is this true?
It's not true. They don't average the score. So they'll just take the highest score. Now they can see all your scores. So they do have access to view them, but they will have to consider the highest one. That's what gets factored into their medians and all that stuff. In terms of whether to take it in February or the summer, it's really when you're prepared to take it. If you're ready for February, then take it in February. Now, since you're in undergrad, you know, what stands out to me is, of course, just balancing your academic coursework. When you apply to law school, your GPA is important. So, you know, I just don't have your LSAT score come at the expense of your grades. And if it means for your schedule that perhaps it'd be better to take it in the summer, I think that's just going to depend a little bit on your personal circumstances.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add there. I think I agree with everything Madeline said. It's just consider your circumstances and the timing that you need to finish the test by. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. I think we have a question that's more specific to working with jurists. Samara asks, I see your program is sold in hour increments. Is it one-on-one assistance for 24 to 60 hours whenever we decide to do so?
One-on-one tutoring for 24 to 60 hours. Most of my students schedule recurring times each week, and so it's not like a spot treatment thing. But I also like shift people around. People make makeup appointments. Yeah, so one-on-one assistance, and basically anytime you want it within reason. Yeah.
Okay. Clara asks, hi, now that logic games are no longer part of the test, are the logic game style sequencing questions still showing up on the logical reasoning questions? I started taking old tests. Thank you.
No, there's going to be nothing related to logic games on logical reasoning. I would say the only conceptual overlap is what we call conditional logic or conditional reasoning. But even then, it's conceptually the same, but it's expressed a bit differently in logical reasoning. So there's no diagramming, there's none of this, dash, 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 any of that stuff that you may, you would do in logic games. If you're at all or familiar with that section, you might not be. And in that case, you don't need to do anything in regards to it. But if you're taking old tests, and I'm assuming if you've seen it, then you're maybe looking at like the original versions with the logic games, you can just disregard that section.
Yeah,
Okay.
all agreed on that. I see Sophie's message, and I just want to make it clear. I studied for 2.5 months before I got my 172, and then I studied 3 more months to get my 179. So I did not get a 179 in 2.5 months of study. I got the 172, and then I taught part-time while still studying on my own time, and that's finally what got me to the 179. So when I say 200 hours and then 400 hours to reach max, that's because I probably put another 200 hours in over those 3 months. So a lot of time investment to get scores like that.
For sure. Okay, question from Anita. Is Khan Academy a good resource to use for studying for the LSAT exam? And then they also ask, are there any free practice tests and where can I find them?
Yeah, I'll answer this. Khan is okay. I think they've phased out a lot of their material now, if I understand correctly. I think they used to have a lot more, and the LSAC has sort of taken it back for their own website. But I still think there is some stuff on there. My experience with Khan is that a lot of people tend to outgrow it fairly quickly. And there's good stuff on there, but it just tends to be a bit limited. And I think most people, again, are just going to sort of outgrow that. I would say the best place for free practice tests is LSAC. They have a platform called Law Hub, and on there are 4 free practice tests that are available for everyone. But I typically suggest, like, if there's anything to purchase and spend money on, it is accessing additional practice tests. I think for most people, if not all, 4 practice tests is not going to be enough. But especially if you're just looking to get started, maybe do a diagnostic, kind of dip your toes, see what's going on, I would go to Law Hub, it's called.
Okay.
Yeah, same answer.
Sorry. I feel like I'm always cutting you off. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Question from Shantae. Do I wait to take the LSAT and get my score to apply to law school?
Yes, you have. There are technically schools that will not require the LSAT, but you should take the LSAT. You basically need to, unless you have like an insane GRE score and you're going to like do a joint program between the law school and another school, you kind of need to take the LSAT before you apply. You can apply without having taken the LSAT yet, I think, but then the school will just be like, why are you doing this? And you'll have to send an addendum that says I'm taking it in January or whenever. And then the school will not consider your application until the LSAT score comes in. So you won't get admitted to a law school basically without having an LSAT score.
Okay. Abina asks, what would you recommend as the top study guides to get as close to 180 as possible?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I think this is sort of just echoing a little bit of what I said earlier. I think is somewhat going to be personal preference. Now, of course, I think there are certain resources that are probably objectively more effective than others. But I think it is, again, worth exploring, kind of doing some additional research. I think working with a tutor can, I think, often provide a lot more structure and direction towards getting to the highest percentile. Just as Mika mentioned earlier, a tutor can really help set you on an efficient and effective plan to show up and get it done and stay consistent and really track your progress. But again, that's something that you can continue to do additional research on as well. And again, I don't know, Mika, you may have something to add.
I have one resource that I use with every student. It's called The Loophole, and an LSAT logical reasoning. I highly recommend that. I think it is kind of the unquestioned intro resource for logical reasoning. I I would say that is the only written resource that I like very, very strongly recommend you get.
Okay, I think we're out of time, unfortunately. I know there are some questions that are still in the chat box. So if you do have a question and it didn't get answered, remember that you can get a free consultation with Juris and with our consultants here just by scanning that QR code. Just a reminder for everybody that maybe joined a little bit later, we are going to be emailing this webinar out. So if you want to go ahead and review or if you missed something, we will be sending that to your mailboxes tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for that really insightful and informative webinar. I know I learned a lot, and I hope you guys did too. For everybody that's applying to law school this year or studying for their LSAT, good luck, and we will see you at the next webinar. Take care, everyone. Have a great night.